There's a moral case for LGBT equality, and there's a human rights case for LGBT equality. But did you know that there's an economic case for it?
And the economic case may be the strongest argument we have in today's environment.
That's why we're excited to host MV Lee Badgett on Queer Money episode 223 to talk about her book, Economic Case for LGBT Equality.
It's an informative and powerful episode, so let's get into it. But listen to the end to see how you could possibly win a copy of Lee's book.
So welcome, Lee Badgett, to the Queer Money podcast. I can't tell you how excited we are to have you. I feel like David and I are fangirling right now.
Oh, that's sweet. It's great to be here.
Right. As all of you know, John and I love numbers, and Lee has provided us with a wealth of information as well as numbers. So we dove deep into this one.
Yeah, our messages align so well. And the whole time I'm reading it, I'm like, David, she articulates it a lot better than we can. So we need to have her on the show. So we want to thank you so much for making time in your schedule and coming on the show. We appreciate that. So to get the conversation kicked off, I'm curious, what made you think it was why did you think it was important to create an economic case for LGBTQ equality, as opposed to maybe focusing more on the human rights or the moral cases for LGBTQ equality?
It's been around for a while, the idea of an economic case for equality. If you go back to the 60s, you could see people making that very argument in terms of the civil rights movement and pushing for civil rights protections. We've heard some of this in lots of contexts around gender and women in the economy. And it didn't really fully emerge for me until I had been working for a while in the United States on different issues of LGBT rights. So in the context of things like marriage equality, economic claims started to be made about what would happen if same-sex couples could get married. And so, for example, so we talked about the rights. This was an important thing for why couples should have the right to marry, and the rights and benefits that sometimes go along with it, were part of that argument. But then some state legislators started saying, well, if there are all these rights and benefits, that's going to be expensive. So we cannot afford to let same-sex couples get married because our budgets will, go crazy and blah, blah, blah.
I remember
so that. Yeah, right. So like, okay, I can answer that question as an economist. I can go make estimates. And so my Williams Institute colleagues and I did a lot of studies that showed that actually state budgets would be better off if more people got married, if same-sex couples could get married. And then we started thinking about this from the perspective of businesses. If they provide benefits for spouses, is this going to be bad for them in some way? And already there was a well-established business case for equality. Businesses said, we know we need to treat our LGBT employees fairly because we want to attract the best workers. We want to retain the best workers. We want people to be as productive as they can be. So, hearing it in that context, it was not a huge step to kind of put that together and to talk about it from a broad economic perspective. But I didn't really do it until 2014. I got asked by some folks at the World Bank to estimate the cost of homophobia and transphobia in India, which is a country they had an interest in. And I tried to, to think about how could we estimate that, and looking at differences in health, looking at some differences in labor force opportunities, I was able to come up with at least a rough estimate that it would be as much as 1% of their GDP lost because of homophobia and transphobia. So that sort of pulled me into talking a lot about that in different parts of the world. And I wrote that book because I was talking about it so much one day. I was about to go on stage at a development bank to talk about it. And I thought, I need to write this down. Then I won't have to say it over and over and over again. People can read it, So that's how the book was born, actually.
Gotcha. And then now you have a series of people inviting you onto their podcast and their TV shows to talk about the book that you wrote, so you don't have to keep repeating the argument.
That's right. Yeah. Well, that's right. There's you can never not repeat things. I mean, and that's good though. I mean, I'm a teacher. I know that's how people learn. You have to hear things a lot of times before it really sinks in sometimes.
Yeah. So we're going to dive into some more of that. So I kind of want to take a little bit of a step back. So you make a case early on in the book about minority stress, and that's the result of experiencing stigma in the workplace. And that research has shown how harmful that is to people's physical and mental health. And not just LGBTQ people, but all people. So I'm curious, how does minority stress for all minorities, all marginalized communities, affect minority workers, businesses, and then ultimately the economy?
It's a big problem. It's a big problem. Again, my colleague at the Williams Institute, Ilan Meyer, has done a lot of work on this for LGBT people. But as you said, this is not limited to LGBT people. Health is one of the most important forms of what economists call human capital. I mean, that sounds a little strange, so I just want to explain it for a second. The idea is that there are certain kinds of skills and knowledge and abilities that we have that don't go away. We don't use them up. I come to work today, I'm the same person tomorrow. I haven't used anything up. It's the same brain, working on things. And so that's why we think about it as capital. It sticks around. Mm-hmm. But health is something like that. So if you're ill, you might not be able to work at all. You might only work at a lower level of productivity. I mean, think about if for the millions of people who've had COVID, for example, they've had to take time off from work and stay home. And, the pandemic shows us just how important that loss of good health is, and how devastating it can be for our economies. So we know that that's very important. And without good health, people just will not be performing at their best in their jobs. They won't be able to keep learning and doing their jobs better. So all of these, from whatever the source, racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, whatever the source, it's likely to have the same sort of effect. I mean, I take a step back sometimes and I think, I'm just focusing on the LGBT side, but if we looked at all of these different forms of oppression, of poor treatment of people, we're so underperforming as a society, as an economy. We would be all so much better off if there were more equity in all those different realms. So it's a big problem.
Right. Absolutely. I think that one of the things that probably is very apparent in what you're talking about, and we are finally, there's so much more discussion about it today, and that is the mental health side of it, right? It is the productivity is oftentimes affected by that mental health part. You're still showing up to work, but if you're operating at 85, 75, 65% because you're constantly distracted by something, well, then that's not only hurting you, your performance, but it's hurting your employer. But they may not be aware of it to the degree that you are yourself, right? And so they may not think that it's actually happening, or may be able to let it pass, right? Mm-hmm. When it really shouldn't be passing.
Yeah, that's a great point. Definitely. It's not always visible. People aren't always sneezing and coughing, and that they're not feeling well. And we know that some of these health disparities are related to mental health. When you look at the stats, it doesn't look good. We have higher LGBT people have higher rates of anxiety and depression, higher rates of substance use. So on the mental health side, it is devastating, and I think that's really reflects the kind of uncertainty that people still face, even as things get better. We carry the past in our bodies, for one thing, and there's still a lot of variation in treatment around how LGBT people are treated by their families, by their neighbors and their coworkers, and the microaggressions that people have heard a lot about are also present for LGBT people, and added together, it can still be really devastating for people.
Absolutely. And unfortunately, for the sake of time, early on in your book, you talk a lot about LGBTQ, homophobia, transphobia in education, as well as in healthcare, and how all of that can affect people's productivity down the line. We won't, for the sake of time, we can't really dive into all of that, but it does have an exponential effect on productivity, even 10, 20, 30 years later, when someone's finally adult in the workforce, you're still, as you say, carrying all that with them into the workplace, and that's affecting their day-to-day life as adults.
Right. That's right. That's right. Having lower levels of education, poor quality of education, that feeds back on the mental health stuff that we were just talking about, those outcomes. And it means people are arriving at the workplace without the same kind of preparation and skills that they're capable of. So it's a loss on many counts.
When we interviewed Jay Allen on the very first podcast of episode of Queer Money, and Jay was the former SVP of Charles Schwab, and he talked about he was an out gay man when he was in the executive leadership position, and he talked about how his biggest goal was to try to get all the employees to bring 100% of themselves to work, regardless of their sexual orientation, gender identity, whatever their background is. And I think it's very interesting, especially as you bring up the mental health, the fact that we're talking more about mental health these days. Deloitte University Leadership Center for Inclusion reported in 2015, and I think there have been a couple of studies since this came out, but that 61% of US workers, including 45% of straight white men, are hiding something about themselves at work. And to Jay's argument, that means they're not able to bring their full selves to work, and that's hurting the company bottom line, productivity, all of that. With that, do you think that businesses are doing enough to create safe and inclusive work environments for all people, especially LGBTQ people? And if not, what more could they do?
Right. Yeah, that's a big question. I think we've certainly seen a lot of changes in policies by big companies, which is a very important start. There's more inclusion of LGBT issues in, say, diversity training. There's more discussion about it very openly, better policies, non-discrimination policies. So I think there's definitely movement in the right direction. The big question is, how much does it get at that kind of underlying culture that people are working in that seems to not be very supportive? That's a pretty stunning statistic, actually. I think that more than half of people don't feel accepted. That a legal scholar at NYU, Kenji Yoshino, I don't know if you've had him on your show or not. He's written a book called Covering a while back now, that makes the same kind of case, that we think of hiding and trying to be invisible as LGBT people is just us, but it's really not. There are all sorts of ways that people have to toe the line of the norm. So it's hard to know how well companies are doing in terms of that larger picture. That statistics suggest there's still a long way to go for everybody, not just for LGBT people.
I think back to just kind of the time frame when John and I were at Schwab. We were pushing for Schwab to have literature that showed people from the LGBT community as a part of the marketing material that advisors would use when they would go out and speak to their LGBT clients. We literally had advisors asking for this. And when Schwab marketing and D&I came back to us and said, no, we're not going to do that. We don't want to do that. We at first of all, it was kind of odd for us to hear it from D&I, but we kind of knew that the culture of the company had started to go more conservative. Literally, both John and I said to ourselves, I don't know if we have a future at this company anymore. And I think that I know personally, my productivity in part started to decline because I started to think about where should I go? Where should I go where we feel accepted and we can encourage our company to be more supportive of the people in their community that they're serving? And I think that a lot of companies, there are probably a lot of people who are sitting in their companies saying to themselves, I just don't know if my company supports me. And that carries them into a place of, I don't know if I can give 100% if my company doesn't want to give 100% back to me.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. If then the more people like that, the worse off that company is, and they may never realize it.
Yeah. And I guess this really makes me think of well, it's happening. It's more pervasive, I think, than we've talked about a whole lot. But everything that's going on to Disney right now, and the LGBTQ employees there who aren't happy that their leadership didn't come out more forcefully against the Don't Say Gay bill. And I'm wondering, to what extent is the community, including those, especially those people who are working in corporate America, those Fortune 500 companies, I wonder if they're starting to feel that, oh, my company is speaking out of both sides of its mouth. They have this D&I program. They have these BRGs to support me. They give us $250 a year to sponsor Pride or whatever they can seem to afford, throw some bones.
Yeah.
But then I know they're also, at the same time, they're giving money to politicians who I know and they know aren't supporting me in the long run. So I wonder if that's also having an effect on people's productivity, knowing I know that my company is speaking out of both sides of its mouth, but I also need to put food on my table.
Right. That's the trade-off. Yeah. I mean, I think companies are relying on that second pressure on employees far too much, right? To assume that having a job is the only thing that they care about. Having the paycheck is all that matters. And that is not the case, clearly. Right. Yeah, I think the situation that you just outlined reveals a couple of really important things. Number one, companies might have done really well in the past, but you don't get to rest on those laurels. You have to keep performing, keep being inclusive, keep pushing out on inclusion. And I think that was the shocking thing about Disney in many ways. They used to be much more out there, and then something happened and they seemed to have pulled back, and then realize that people do notice those things. Their employees notice those things. So, the responsiveness to employees, I think, will be interesting to see, especially around the political contributions. People know, and there's been a lot of backlash against companies over the last few years about those kinds of contributions. So it may be, who knows, maybe we will see some retreat from as active participation in that kind of that particular part of our political process. I'm not
maybe
even sure.
Companies will say, we're not going to donate to anybody.
Maybe so. You never know. But companies like to do both. I mean, they like to hedge their bets. So,
exactly.
So it's not really clear that it reflects a real strong opinion on their parts, as much as being, protective of their interests in some way, no matter who's in charge. So, so you can kind of understand that on one level, but on another level, say, then you really are not supporting me if you are supporting these people who are pushing this other agenda. So it's something, and I do think too that the other thing, the authenticity, the integrity of companies is being challenged. I mean, pinkwashing is now the worst label. All of my students talk about this. They are they're very skeptical about corporations and the sincerity of their efforts. They think that a lot of it is pinkwashing in many cases. So I think that's a bad sign for employers. It's going to make it a lot harder for them to really convince their employees and their customers that they are sincere.
But it does seem like companies are benefiting when they are doing some of this, right? We've seen that companies, even you mentioned this in your book, that companies that are out there, whether it's policies or what they're doing in the community or the organizations that they're supporting or the politicians that they're supporting, it does look like they are benefiting financially from this, because I think what you said, it was right. It was Credit Suisse said that the stock prices of 270 companies that with open LGBT senior management had outperformed similar companies in their industry. It does kind of beg the question, though, is it the support of the LGBT community that is causing that, or is there something different about those companies?
That's the big question, actually, and I can tell you my building is full of people who think about that question nonstop, showing, which way that goes, what the causal path is hard. It's hard in academia. And there have been other studies in addition to that internal Credit Suisse one that have tried to do the same thing. And basically the idea is they're asking, we can see companies that are doing well, so that are adding protections. When they add them compared to how they were doing in the past, are they doing better? So that gets a lot closer to being able to assert that it's not just something about them, because that was true 2 years, before, they added domestic partner benefits or gender affirmation benefits to their healthcare plan, and now we see them doing better. So I think that suggests that it's probably both. There probably are some companies that are more likely to do all of those things, and there are some companies who are who think about them for a long time, consider them for a long time, and then do them, and then they get those financial rewards.